In the beginning of Wuthering Heights, we meet one of the two narrators, Lockwood. Lockwood tells of his very first visit to Wuthering Heights. He meets Heathcliff, who becomes his landlord because he wants to rent out space at Wuthering Heights. Lockwood notices the year 1500 and the name Hareton Earnshaw over the door and is very curious. While waiting in the kitchen of Thrushcross Grange, Heathcliff's dogs attack him, and Zillah and Heathcliff come in to help him. Lockwood begins walking toward Wuthering Heights, and Hareton lets him in. No one will help him back to Thrushcross Grange, so he grabs a lamp and goes back himself. Joseph thinks he is stealing, so he tells the dogs to attack him, which knocks him down and gives him a bloody nose, so he stays the night. Zillah, a servant, leads Lockwood back to a room where Heathcliff allows no one to stay. In this room, he sees the names Catherine Linton, Catherine Earnshaw, and Catherine Heathcliff etched into the windowsill. In the room, he finds Catherine's diary, which explains her past with Hindley, stating how cruelly he treated everyone, but talks about Heathcliff more positively. When Lockwood falls asleep, he has two nightmares. In the first, he dreams of calling a priest a sinner and starting a riot, but in the second, he has a dream where he breaks through a window to stop the tapping of a tree branch, and he feels a cold hand of a ghost. This ghost says it is Catherine Linton, and it repeats, "Let me in," over and over again. He wakes up screaming, and Heathcliff comes in angrily because no one stays in that room. However, when Lockwood tells Heathcliff his dream, Heathcliff starts screaming to Catherine because he wants her ghost to haunt him. The next morning, Lockwood is eager to leave, and he goes back to Thrushcross Grange. At Thrushcross Grange, he meets Nellie, who knows a lot about Heathcliff's and Catherine's past, so he asks her to tell him all about them. She starts at the beginning when Mr. Earnshaw, Catherine and Hindley's father, go on a trip to Liverpool. He asks the children what gifts they want. Instead of returning home with the gifts, he returns home with Heathcliff, an orphan. Catherine and Hindley treat him terribly because they never got their gifts, but eventually Catherine comes around. Nellie does not like Heathcliff either because of his manipulative behavior, but he is still his father's favorite. Mr. Earnshaw becomes very sick, so everyone tries to leave him alone and do their best not to disturb him, besides Hindley, who keeps picking on Heathcliff, which makes Mr. Earnshaw very mad because Heathcliff is his favorite. At this time, Hindley then goes to college, so Wuthering Heights is a little bit more peaceful, but then Mr. Earnshaw dies. Catherine and Heathcliff console each other in light of their father's death. Coming home for his father's funeral, Hindley brings home a wife, Frances. Because Hindley now has more power with Mr. Earnshaw dead, he forces Heathcliff to be a servant and work on the land. He also totally deprives Heathcliff of any further education. Because he is so obsessed with this new power, he does not watch Catherine and Heathcliff closely, and they sneak out to the moors into Thrushcross Grange to spy on the Lintons almost every night. While they were spying, a servant releases a bulldog which attacks Catherine and bites her in the ankle. The Lintons feel bad about this and take Catherine in for 5 weeks to take care of her ankle. They do not like Heathcliff, so they send him away. After 5 weeks, Catherine finally returns home, but she has changed. Her manners are much better, and she is classier than before. She even laughs at Heathcliff for being dirty. At this time, the Lintons accept an invitation to Wuthering Heights for a Christmas party on one condition: Heathcliff cannot come. Nellie, not knowing this, offers to help Heathcliff be more proper for the party to impress Catherine. He is hesitant at first, but later comes to Nellie and says, "I want to be good." When Heathcliff comes down for the party, Hindley threatens to lock him and beat him. So he locks him up in his room and beats him. Catherine can't stand the party alone, so she climbs over the rafters into Heathcliff's room, and when Nellie finds them, Heathcliff vows revenge on Hindley. Moving forward, Hindley's wife, Frances, gives birth to Hareton and dies during the birth. Hindley turns to alcohol to cope and becomes a terrible human because of this, and runs all of his servants out of the house. Catherine is also struggling with her emotions, unable to decide between Edgar or Heathcliff, so she acts out a lot, even slapping Edgar and Nellie. However, Edgar forgives her, and they confess their love for one another. Hindley, more cruel than ever, threatens Nellie with a knife and drunkenly dangles Hareton over the balcony. When he drops Hareton, Heathcliff is below and catches him, but he instantly regrets doing so because it would have been good revenge. In the midst of all this, Kathy tells Nellie about how she is going to marry Edgar. Nellie doesn't think she really loves him, so she questions her. She then confesses that marrying Heathcliff would be degrading for her, but then Nellie says she thinks Heathcliff might have been listening. Heartbroken, she says that she really does love Heathcliff and that whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. Distressed, she spends all night looking for Heathcliff in the rain, but never finding him. Nellie begins to tell the story 3 years later when Edgar and Catherine marry. Catherine begs Nellie to come to Thrushcross with Hareton, so Nellie goes. Finally, after 3 long years, Heathcliff returns a more classy, rich, and handsome man. Kathy is so excited to see him, but he reveals he's back to kill Hindley. Isabella, Edgar's sister, begins to fall in love with Heathcliff, which makes Catherine mad, and they get into a physical fight. Heathcliff threatens to punch Isabella so hard in the face that he leaves bruises all over her. Then, Catherine demands Heathcliff to stop seeing Isabella and yells at him to marry her if he loves her so much, and Catherine doesn't believe he loves her. Edgar hears the fighting and goes to kick out Heathcliff, but Catherine takes Heathcliff's side and locks all the doors and throws the keys into the fire, and Heathcliff and Edgar are forced to physically fight. Edgar knocks Heathcliff down and he leaves, so he tells Catherine to choose between him and Heathcliff, and she says that their love lacks passion. Refusing to come out of her room because she is so torn between Edgar and Heathcliff, she doesn't even recognize herself in the mirror anymore, and she begins to feel sick. Throughout this, Nellie is hearing rumors Isabella and Heathcliff ran away, and when Edgar can confirm the rumors are true, he disowns Isabella as a sister.
As we continue on to chapter 13, Catherine's brain fever starts to become worse, but with Edgar's care, she starts to recover, besides finding out that she is pregnant. As this is going on, we learn that Isabella sent a letter to Edgar, explaining how she is marrying Heathcliff, and Edgar does not reply. Isabella is already starting to miss the Grange and realizes that no one defends her at the Heights. Hindley shows Isabella his gun and tells her to lock her bedroom because he wants to murder Heathcliff. Isabella ends up sleeping on a chair in Harrington's room. Heathcliff tries to find her and tell her Catherine is becoming sicker and that it is Isabella's brother's fault. Edgar then explains to Nellie he wants nothing to do with Isabella because of her marriage to Heathcliff. Nellie then goes to check on Isabella at Wuthering Heights. When Nellie arrives, she realizes that the house is in ruins. Nellie tells Isabella about how Edgar will not be talking to her anymore. Nellie also tries to talk to Heathcliff, telling him to let her be, but as usual, Heathcliff says he will not let her go, and to help try to have him see her. As we continue on to chapter 15, Nellie finally tells Catherine that Heathcliff wants to visit. Heathcliff then storms into Catherine's room. Catherine looks at him with anger and says that he's the one killing her. Catherine says she wants to die and that she wants Heathcliff to die with her. Edgar then storms in, ignoring the fact that Heathcliff is visiting. Heathcliff then leaves, waiting in the garden, saying he will wait until the time has come. Little Catherine is now born, 2 months premature, and Catherine dies just after giving birth. Nellie then goes out to the garden and tells Heathcliff what has happened. Heathcliff cries out for Catherine to haunt him. Heathcliff sneaks into the house and says one last goodbye. He replaces Edgar's hair in the locket with his hair. Catherine's body is then laid to rest outside near the moor instead of being by the rest of the Linton family. Nellie is caring for the baby while Edgar is still mourning. Isabella comes all the way from Wuthering Heights. Isabella throws her wedding ring into the fire. She then explains to Nellie how Heathcliff has been acting. She explains how Hindley and Heathcliff have been fighting a lot lately. A few months after Catherine's passing, Hindley finally dies. Nellie becomes more nervous about Harrington living at the Heights with his uncle Heathcliff. Isabella then moves to London and had a son named Linton. Since Isabella is dying, she begs for Edgar to take care of Linton. Edgar leaves to London and Nellie is left with Kathy. She lets her roam around, and one day she leaves to go to Wuthering Heights. Nellie goes to search for her and finds out that she's talking to Harrington. Edgar then sends them a letter saying that Isabella has died and that he's returning home with Linton. Joseph comes to take Linton to Heathcliff. Edgar does not want to let this happen, but he has no choice since Heathcliff is Linton's real father. The next morning, Nellie wakes up Linton very early to take him to Heathcliff. Linton is confused because Isabella never spoke of Heathcliff. In the beginning, Linton and Heathcliff get off to a rough start because of Heathcliff's rude comments towards his own son. The housekeeper at Wuthering Heights updates Nellie about how Linton and Heathcliff, as expected, isn't going well. Kathy, for her birthday, wants to spend a day on the moors, and they end up running into Heathcliff, where he invites them back to his house. Heathcliff then announces the plan to have Kathy and Linton get married. The reason he's wanting them to get married is that now he can take over Thrushcross Grange if Linton and Kathy end up getting married. Heathcliff enjoys pitting Harrington against Linton because it makes Linton seem more appealing to Kathy. Kathy tells Edgar about the plan and explains that this is the only way for him to get back for what happened before. Edgar then becomes very ill. Nellie takes Kathy out after she is upset for ending her romance with Linton. Heathcliff sees Kathy and starts yelling at her for starting to send love letters to Linton, but then stops. Nellie then tells Kathy she will take her to Wuthering Heights tomorrow. Nellie and Kathy arrive to see Linton looking pathetic. Linton is upset with Kathy for ignoring him and complains about how he's being treated. Once they leave, Nellie tells Kathy that she will put a lock on the gate so that she can't leave. This does not happen because Nellie ends up becoming sick and Edgar is continuing to be sick. Kathy is now able to do whatever she wants. A suspicious Nellie finds out that Kathy has been sneaking away to Wuthering Heights during her illness. Nellie forces the truth out of her, and Kathy tells her. She tells her that she goes to the Heights every night. She and Linton spend a lot of time together talking, telling stories, finding out how much they don't have in common. One day she ran into Harrington, who tries to impress Kathy that he can now read his own name above the door. Kathy just mocks him and goes back into the house. Harrington bursts in and throws a screaming Linton into the kitchen. Linton blames Kathy for the scene, but they end up making up. Nellie then tells Edgar about Kathy's visit to Heights, forbidding her to go back again.
As the story continues, Edgar becomes more and more ill. He tells Nellie that it would be okay if Kathy married Linton, so he allows them to see one another. When they go see Linton, they see that Linton is very ill and frail and could barely leave Wuthering Heights. Tricked into entering the Heights, they get trapped there. They stay there for 4 days and 5 nights, locked up in a room. During that time, Linton and Kathy are forced to be married. After Hareton lets Nellie out, she goes to see Edgar, and he is very close to death. With the help of Linton, Kathy escapes too, only to see her father die. Now that Edgar is dead and Linton and Kathy are married, the Grange now belongs to Heathcliff. Heathcliff fires every servant and tells everyone to leave. He is going to rent out the Grange. Nellie stays, but Kathy must return to Wuthering Heights to see her dying husband. This is where Nellie's narrative ends, and she begins to say that she now gets her gossip from Zillah. We switch to Zillah's perspective, and we see that Kathy and Hareton often argue and are beginning to fall in love. Now we go back to Lockwood, who returns to Wuthering Heights some time later. Here we find out that Heathcliff has died. Nellie begins to tell of how his end came. Hareton and Kathy have fallen in love and are to be engaged soon. Though this disgusted Heathcliff, after Kathy stood up for herself, he no longer challenged her. He became oddly happy, and whenever someone asked him for an explanation, he would only say that the end is near. One day, Nellie enters his room and sees him dead on the floor with a smirk on his face. Now, people of Wuthering Heights and the Grange say that the ghosts of Catherine and Heathcliff haunt the moors. The book ends with Lockwood passing the graves of Heathcliff, Catherine, and Edgar.